when Italy was declared a kingdom in 1861, Rome was not part of it. Rome was ruled by the Pope, and the Pope was protected by the French army. Only about 10 years later, when the Franco-Prussian War broke out and the Prussians were heading into France, the French army was withdrawn and the Italian army took Rome. The Pope refused to recognize the Italian state, excommunicated the whole of the Savoy royal family, and never left the Vatican for 60 years. He described himself as the prisoner in the Vatican. The papal states had been in existence for about 1,000 years, and they had always ruled Rome, and now it was ruled by the Savoy royal family. On the horse at the top is Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of United Italy. His father was the king of Piedmont, Turin, and Sardinia, and he had the title number one, and so Victor Emmanuel II kept that name second, even though he's the first king of Italy. His son, Umberto I, was assassinated by an anarchist from New Jersey. The third king of Rome, third king of Italy, and the person who has quite a decisive impact upon our discussion of World War II is King Victor Emmanuel III. Victor Emmanuel III was the king who took Italy into World War I on the side of the British and the French, and then later on the Americans. And during that war, at the outset of the war, there was a young man called Benito Mussolini. He was the leading member of the Italian Socialist Party. He was the editor of the Avanti Socialist newspaper, and he believed Italy should be in the war. And so he was kicked out of the Socialist Party for supporting this because they believed in the International, Workers of the World Unite, and they did not think that Italy should be involved in the capitalist war. He's kicked out of the Socialist Party. He's given money by British intelligence to found his own newspaper because they want Italy in the war on their side. And after the war, he sets up his own party, which is the Fascist Party. And this was on Milan on the 23rd of March, 1919. At the end of World War I, you've seen the Russian Revolution, you've seen the overthrow of Emperor of Austria, the Kaiser of Germany, the Ottoman Sultan in Turkey, and of course the Tsar in Russia. The king is pretty nervous about all these revolts happening throughout Europe. And in Italy, there's a time called the Biennio Rosso, the Red 2 years, where there are uprisings, strikes, factory occupations, land seizures. And Mussolini's party, which never did any good in any election, is being hired by the landowners, the factory owners, to put down the strikes and stop the occupations. And gradually, the money and the recruits he gets into his army of black shirts increases. And even though they never win an election, they decide to march on Rome on the 28th of October, 1922, to demand that the king give them power. Now, the king is pretty nervous about all these uprisings. He's seen what's happening in the rest of Europe. He's only been, the royal family's only been there for the last 60 years, so they're not got strong roots. And Mussolini basically offers the king a deal. The king can keep his powers and money and just hand them up to Mussolini the power. The king offers Mussolini the Italian prime minister's job on the 29th of October, 1922. Just to step back a little bit and explain about what this means, the fascism thing means. By the Vittorian monument, there is the column of Trajan. Winding up the column is the history of Trajan's campaign in what is now Romania. Partway up the column, there is an image of Trajan. This is Trajan, and he's surrounded by his bodyguards, who are the lictors, and they are carrying the fasces. The fasces is a bundle of 12 rods with an axe, which symbolizes the authority of the emperor or the consul. It is the authority of the ruler of Rome. This symbol was adopted in many countries. For example, in America, you'll find it on Lincoln's memorial, the armrest. You'll find it behind the speaker in Congress. It's the classic image of Washington. It's on the seal of the United States Senate. It's not just America adopted it. The French do too. Every French passport has got a fasces on the front of it. It's simply the symbol of the authority of ancient Rome. The American fasces differs from the ancient Roman one. Ancient Roman one is 12 rods. The American is 13 rods for the 13 original colonies. Mussolini takes that as his symbol, and we'll see them all around Rome. And he starts his party with and gives it the name Fasci di Combattimento. the fighting fasces, the fighting bundles, the fighting groups. And this becomes the name of the fascists. He's been given the job of power. He's going to gradually turn Italy into a totalitarian state. Italy at this point had been a democracy. And one of the first things he does earlier, one, not the first, but in his reign, before he's got the full totalitarian state going, he decides to do a deal with the Pope who hasn't left the Vatican for 60 years. This is the Vatican in 1929 when the Lateran Accords were signed. As you see, there is no Via Conciliazione. Via Conciliazione, the big white street at the front of the Vatican, means the reconciliation between the Italian state and the Vatican City. They do the deal. The Vatican City becomes a separate country. They destroy all this neighborhood in the middle to create this wide street, symbolically linking the Vatican to the river and to the sea. They build the railway in. They build the border wall. They transform this area a bit. If you go on Via Conciliation now, they have islands with obelisks and lamps on to give the road symmetry because the original buildings were not built on either side of a street. There was a whole neighborhood between them. The effect of the Lateran Accords and why it matters for when we talk about the Nazi occupation is that it created not just the Vatican City state up here, but all the extraterritorial properties of the Holy See in Rome. So if you look at St. Mary Major, St. John Lateran, St. Paul's Basilica, they are not Italy. They are part of the Vatican City state. When you're in St. Mary Major, you are no longer in Italy. This means this is quite important for when the Nazis occupied Rome, because they respected the Vatican's territory and would not enter in that. Also, another place which is not part of Italy is the Pope's summer residence down in Castel Sant'Angelo. So now Mussolini's dealt with the king, he's dealt with the Pope, and he sets about building his totalitarian state. In Rome, just by Piazza Navona, we have Palazzo Braschi, which is now the Museum of Rome. At 90 years ago, this is what it looked like. This is the 1934 referendum. This building was the headquarters of the Rome Federation of Fascists, and elections had been finished. There were no more elections anymore. There was simply a yes-no vote. Mussolini put forward a list of candidates. You could either say yes or no. Mussolini was not on the ballot. You could not vote him out. He was simply il duce, the leader. People had to vote, and if anybody did vote no, then if the no's won, Mussolini would give them another list of candidates until they voted yes. And if somebody did vote no, everybody knew about it. So that was the state of the country in 1934. Every newspaper editor was personally appointed by Mussolini. All the school curriculum was transformed to promote fascism, and every teacher and university lecturer had to swear an oath to defend the fascist regime. All industry in the country is put under is to report to the Fascist Party, and they build on Via Vittoria Veneto near the American Embassy a palace of the corporations to control Italian industry. And for young Italians from the age of 8 onwards, they're all expected to join the fascist youth movement. Every other organization, such as the Scouts for Kids, was banned. You had to join the fascist youth. Just want to talk about another area where the fascists started the whole idea of controlling everything. And this was with the controlling time. A lot of you familiar with Castel Sant'Angelo, which is originally the mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian. If you go in the gardens around there and you look at the gateposts, the entrances to all the gardens around Castel Sant'Angelo, and you have a close look at the details, what you see is 3 fasces which have all been damaged following the fall of fascism. They've been hammered away. But you have there A for Italian anno, so year, like our anniversary or annual annuity. Year XII, year 12, EF, year 12 of the era of the fascists. They don't even put the standard date on. Everybody in Italy by now is used to the fact they are dating time from the moment that Mussolini took power on the 29th of October. Fascist years do not start on January the 1st. They start on the 29th of October when Mussolini took power. So when we say year 12, it's probably 1922 plus 12, 1934. But it might not be if it's November or December that they built the door there. In the Garden of there are other ways that they express this time. Sometimes they say the age of the lictor, so it'd be year 12 at the age of the lictor. Another formulation that you see around Rome is something you see in the gardens of the Castel Sant'Angelo. There's a statue of Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian. Emperor Hadrian, it was his mausoleum originally. And if you look at the statue in the garden and you take a close look at the base, what you'll see is, yes, you've got Senate of the People of Rome, Emperor Caesar, Hadrian, Augustus, but down at the bottom, you've got year 12, a fascibus renovatus. Year 12 since the renewal of the fasces, the renewal of the authority of ancient Rome. So Mussolini sees himself, he sees ancient Rome as an inspiration to the Italian people, as a way of bringing together all those different parts of the country, which had only 60 years ago been separate. And he sees himself as the successor of Caesar and Augustus. And he wants to create a new Roman Empire. One of the things that a lot of you people who've been to Rome will be familiar with are the maps by the Colosseum, showing the growth of ancient Rome from a small city, expanding through Italy and Spain, and through even further, and then on to Britain, the widest extent. You'll see on the maps, you can see on the maps a little fascist dating because they were put there again year 12. They were put there on the 21st of April, which is historically the birthday of Rome, and a day that became very important under the fascists because they cancelled May Day as a holiday and had the 21st of April, the birthday of Rome, as the national holiday, when things like this were placed on the walls and celebrated the newsreel, etc. If you look at this wall, there's a bunch of stripes on it, and that's sort of an indication of what was there pre-war. What was there pre-war, following on from the growth of the ancient Roman Empire, you have Mussolini's new empire. If you look at the old picture, you can see where they have the three fasces on the corner of each one. They've all been carefully knocked off nowadays, so you don't see them. This map was taken down after the war. You'll see pictures of the Allies there in front of it because it was still on the wall at the time of liberation, but it was removed afterwards. And what that shows is about Mussolini's empire in new Roman Empire. The plaque says the Empire of Fascist Italy, year 14, which is we've got 1938. 36, pardon me. 1936. And what this is saying is because they've conquered the empire of Ethiopia, because Haile Selassie was an emperor, that means that the king of Italy is now also the emperor of Ethiopia, and thus so this is the new fascist Italy empire. It was the invasion of Ethiopia that drove, and the sanctions that followed from the League of Nations, that drove Mussolini into an alliance with Adolf Hitler in Germany. The sanctions from Britain, France, and others meant he turned to Hitler. They got closer and closer. Mussolini visited Berlin. Hitler visits Rome in 1938. They sign the Steel Pact. Later, they signed the Axis Pact. And they are committed to fight alongside each other in the event of war. They both intervene in Spain. And prior to the start of World War II, Mussolini also invades Albania just to build his empire even more. But when Hitler invades Poland and Britain and France declare war, Italy knows they are not ready for a war. It's one thing to invade Albania. It is another thing to take on a mechanized modern army from, say, France or Britain, who've got a massive industrial base. Italy has spent a fortune on Ethiopia and Spain and changing Rome. They cannot fight a modern war. Hitler expects Mussolini to declare war. Mussolini makes excuses and he doesn't declare war because he knows they cannot win it or even participate in it because they have not got the industrial base nor the money to participate in a war. And that stays the case for 9 months. And after 9 months, Mussolini declares war on June 1940. That is 9 months after the initial start of World War II. What has happened since the official start is that Blitzkrieg in France, the British have abandoned all their equipment at Dunkirk and been evacuated from the beaches. The French government has fled Paris. At this point, Mussolini says that they have to get into the war. The war could end at any moment. Italy needs to be in the war so it can be at the victor's table and demand territory and land in places like Malta, Tunisia, wherever. They want to be at the victor's table and demanding things because he believes the war is going to end any minute. Italy is in no position to fight a war, and they only go into it because they think it's about to be over. 9 months after the official start. What happens is they try to invade the south of France and it goes badly. They send aircraft for the Battle of Britain. So the Royal Italian aircraft with the fasces on the wings takes part in the Battle of Britain. The Italian forces have got some great pilots, and the Navy divers are amongst the best in the world, but most of the troops are badly trained and equipped. The invasion of southern France didn't work out. The Greek invasion didn't work out. The colonies in East Africa, like Somalia and Ethiopia, they were lost pretty quickly. North Africa, even with the help of Field Marshal Rommel and the African Corps, they lose all their territories in North Africa. And it is in Russia, where 250,000 Italian soldiers are sent, that they suffered the most casualties. They have to pull their armies out of Russia. 3 years after the declaration of war, a war that was expected to stand less weeks, everything had been going badly because they were never ready for war. And then the worst thing happened. The Allies land in Italy itself. This is Operation Husky on July the 9th, 1943. You have Montgomery taking the East Coast, General Patton taking the West Coast. They take Palermo, they take Messina. Sicily is now in Allied hands. Something happens 10 days after the landing in Sicily that had never happened before. That was the bombing of Rome. And this is the last straw. It's a psychological blow to the capital, which changes the direction of the country. 10 days after the Husky landings, Rome is bombed. At the start of the war, Milan and Turin had been immediately bombed by the British. Nobody had bombed Rome because of the importance and the artistic, and the importance of the city, the history and the art there. Rome had been prepared for bombings. This is the Arch of Constantine with sandbags surrounding it by the Colosseum. The Colosseum had sandbanks of the lower levels, but you couldn't obviously cover the whole thing. This is how it looks today. Michelangelo's Moses in St. Peter in Chains, they brick walled up around it to kind of protect it from potential bomb damage. This is how it looks today. And Piazza Navona, Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers, they built a brick wall again to protect it from possible bomb damage. But nobody bombed Rome. And when they did bomb Rome on the 19th of July, 1943, they made very great care to just hit the main railway station Termini and the two airports in Rome. Even then, when they did the bombing, the area around Termini, which is called San Lorenzo, was badly hit by the bombs which were hitting the railway sidings. There is a park there called the Park of July the 19th, 1943, and in that park are inscribed the names of around 1,700 Italian civilians who were killed in the bombing of Rome. The Pope goes there to just pray with the people and speak with them and hand out money. The king tries to go there and his car is stoned by the people of San Lorenzo. Mussolini goes during the night. And what happens next with this shock to the system is the fall of Mussolini. Now, if you go out to the Olympic Stadium in Rome today, you will see as you arrive, as have millions of sports fans over the years, you will see a 120-foot obelisk with the name Mussolini Dux on it. Dux is the Latin version of Duce for leader. You'll see a stylus fasces. You'll see year 10. And the reason, and just behind it, there are 10,000 square feet of fascist mosaics here today. At the time, the reason why there is so much fascist mosaics and fascist symbols down there is after the liberation of Rome, when the Italians were destroying fascist symbols in the center of Rome, this whole complex became an American military base. It became part of the rest and recreation for the American Fifth Army. And so it was off limits to the Italian citizens. The Americans didn't care what was up there. In fact, they probably found it quite amusing. But the Italians, this is still there outside the Olympic Stadium. That word Dux can also be found in another place. This is Antroduca Dux. That is 50 miles north of Rome. It's a forest cut into the letters Dux and is made out of 20,000 pine trees and covers an area of 20 acres. It was made that way so that Mussolini could see it from Rome. When you look at monuments like this, it's very easy to think of Mussolini as a dictator, but he was never the head of state. That was always the king. And the king at this point was looking for a way of getting rid of Mussolini, but was afraid of how the fascists would react. On the 24th of July, so 5 days after the bombing, meeting in Piazza Venezia, in the Palazzo Venezia, where 3 years earlier Mussolini had declared war because he thought it was about to end, the Grand Council of Fascism meets to take stock of the situation. They all know that there is no point, apart from Mussolini, they all know that things are going very badly. Is there much point in continuing with the war? What can they do about it? Mussolini has promised Hitler they will carry on. His Grand Council of Fascism, though, they have a motion, which they vote on, to transfer control of the army from Mussolini back to the king. That is, in effect, a vote of no confidence. The vote passes. The next day, Mussolini goes to meet the king, assuming that nothing is going to change. The king knows that Mussolini has lost the support of the leaders of fascism, and Mussolini is fired. He is no longer prime minister. That is the thing that when we think of the dictators, Mussolini was fired by the king because he was never the head of state. What happens to Mussolini as he leaves the king's presence? He's put into the back of an ambulance and taken to various places to hide because the Germans immediately start looking to free him. And finally, he ends up in what is sort of a prison, but quite a deluxe one. There's a mountain about an hour and a half west of Rome, east of Rome, called Gran Sasso, the Big Rock. It's the highest mountain in central Italy. At a height of 7,000 feet, there is a hotel that was built as part of the ski resort. This is only reachable by cable car. This is the stop of the cable car. The cable car to the valley floor is 2 miles. The cable. Anybody trying to come up to the hotel or get down from the hotel, you can turn the power off at the top of the cable car or the bottom. It's quite a good prison. And that is where Mussolini is. In the meantime, the king has appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as prime minister. They both promise Hitler that they will carry on fighting along his side. Hitler doesn't believe a word of it. Eisenhower and the Allies realized that the fall of Mussolini makes it possible to get Italy out of the war. At that point, they'd taken Sicily and they were all about focusing on Normandy landings. They were not planning necessarily to invade Italy, but with the fall of Mussolini, it becomes an opportunity to take Italy out of the war. Eisenhower has to get the backing of Churchill and Roosevelt to even begin to talk to these two guys who've been at the heart of fascism for 20 years. And whilst he's getting the permission and getting the guidelines for how to deal with them, Field Marshal Rommel is flooding German troops into Italy. Badoglio and Eisenhower come to an agreement, but Badoglio wants American assistance in defending Rome from the Germans. He wants American help in defending Rome. The plan, the idea, is to have the 82nd Airborne land in the Villa Borghese Gardens in Rome to assist the Italians in defending Rome. At this point, General Maxwell Taylor of the 82nd Airborne, he goes into Rome in his American general's uniform, and the pretense was that he was a prisoner of war who'd been captured, but by the Italians, they were really taking him to meet Badoglio so he could understand how well Italy was prepared. Taylor realizes that Badoglio is not ready at all. Badoglio wants more time. Taylor sees the Germans have taken all the landing sites. So even if they put the paratroopers in the Villa Borghese, they won't be able to resupply them. Taylor messages back to Eisenhower to cancel the landings. The 82nd Airborne are in the air over Sicily when they're told to go back and land. General Mark Clark is sailing for Salerno at that very moment. Badoglio wants more time, but they can't because the Americans are about to land south of Naples at Salerno. Maxwell Taylor managed to get the last flight out of Rome, but now Rome is on its own, and it's going to be up to the Italian forces to defend Rome from the Germans. Now, on the 8th of September, 1943, Eisenhower, who run out of patience with Badoglio, because Badoglio keeps asking for more time, and as we say, he can't give it because Salerno landings are about to take place. Eisenhower announces the armistice on the 8th of September. 2 hours later, Badoglio announces the armistice on Italian radio. There is cheering, there is celebration, but there is also total confusion about what to do with the Germans who are in Italy and other matters. What the Germans do, because they have been expecting this betrayal, is move on Rome. The German paratroopers got a base south of Rome, and they start heading into the city. They go via Frascati. The German commander in Italy is Field Marshal Kesselring. This is his headquarters in Frascati. The Allies bomb his headquarters. They destroy 50% of the town of Frascati. There are 3,000 civilian victims of the bombing of Frascati. Kesselring manages to escape the bombing, but and command his troops. If the Allies had his radio station, he would have been unable to control the German troops who were opposed in the landings at Salerno, and he would have been unable to control the troops who were now moving into Milan, Bologna, Florence, and Rome. The German troops moving into Rome are outnumbered 3-1, but the confusion on the Italian side was about to get a lot worse. In the early hours in the morning, leaving the royal palace, the king, the royal family, Marshal Badoglio, and most of the leading generals get into a set of cars and they leave Rome. They head over the mountains to the east coast in the middle of the night. The people left in Rome have been left with no orders of how to deal with the Germans coming in, and the king has run away. So the morale in the city takes a bit of a knock. A lot of knock. The only resistance is coming from individual military units and officers who try to stop the paratroops who's coming in. This is the pyramid south of Rome, and St. Paul's Gate. It is at South Paul's Gate that the Italian military and civilians try to block the Germans entering the city. They have 570 casualties fighting at the gate there, but the Germans break through and take Rome. Around the city of Rome, there are 12 miles of Rome that stood for over 1,500 years. This is one of the gates into the wall, St. Paul's Gate. The image we just saw of the fighting was at this area which the wall had been removed to put roads through. Next to the pyramid, on this wall, you will see the memorials to that last stand of the Italians trying to keep the Germans out of Rome. There is also a memorial to the first Special Service Force, the Special Forces from USA and Canada, who came through the same way, the same gate in the wall, 9 months later to liberate the city. Kesselring has managed to escape being bombed at Frascati. He now moves into his new headquarters, which is one of the most amazing feats of military engineering in the world. The bunker of Monte Serrate. This is the mountain of Monte Serrate, about 30 miles north of Rome. And inside that, Mussolini had built a whole complex, which never used because he fell before it was completed. Inside there are 3 miles of tunnels, each lined with 6 foot of reinforced concrete. The main rooms have an average height of 26 by 100 feet and 20 feet tall. This is a modern photo image of the bunker of Montserrat, which is now open as a tourist venture. And this gives you an idea of the scale of this thing. Inside there are around 1,000 German military working and living inside the mountain. Kesselring's radio is now at the heart of the mountain with 600 feet of solid mountain rock above it. This is where Kesselring will command the battle for Rome taking place at Monte Cassino Anzio and the city of Rome itself. That day that Kesselring moves in, the same day, the 12th of September, another event takes place. Those paratroopers south of Rome, they take off from their air base, they land upon the mountain of Gran Sasso and rescue Mussolini from the hotel. They fly him to Munich, they fly him off the mountain in a 2-seater plane. Then from the air base south of Rome, all the way up to Munich, he's then set up as the government in the north of Italy, the Republic of Salo. At this point, all the Italian military who hoped that the war was over are then, because Mussolini is now free again and they set him in power, the Germans give the Italian military an ultimatum that they can either fight for Mussolini's army or end up as forced labor in Germany. 95% of the Italian army refuses, and 650,000 Italian military end up as internees in Germany as forced labor. This is from the Museum of the Lives of the Italian Military Internees, which is a museum in Rome dedicated to the experience of these guys. They were not given Geneva Convention rights because Mussolini said they were not prisoners of war. They had simply refused to fight. 50,000 died in Germany and Poland. Same time in places like Rome, that new Mussolini army was drafting 18-year-olds and saying, you've got to come and sign up for the army. Otherwise, you will end up as a draft dodger and can potentially be shot on sight. So that was pretty bad for any young person in Rome, and certainly in Milan, where the occupation lasted longer, because they're all being called up to join Mussolini's army. Overwhelmingly, they refused. They didn't sign up. They went off to hide. They joined the partisans, etc. But that is the Italian Military Internal Museum in Rome. The Germans now have Rome. So here's Castel Sant'Angelo with the half track. Here's Via del Corso Tritone with some Stokes. And there's the Vatican with the anti-aircraft guns. Two of the people amongst the Nazis occupying Rome are quite interesting. Colonel Herbert Kappler, who's the head of the Sicherheitsdienst, but we'll say Gestapo for simplicity. Sicherheitsdienst means security service, and his assistant, Captain Erich Priebke. Colonel Herbert Kappler has the dubious honor of having been played by Richard Burton in the film Massacre in Rome, and by Christopher Plummer in the film The Scarlet and the Black. Christopher Plummer plays opposite Gregory Peck, who plays Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, the Irish priest who was escaped prisoner of war and Jews throughout Rome throughout the Nazi occupation. Kappler and Priebke, they set up their torture chambers at Via Tasso, which is now the Museum of the Liberation. Over 2,000 people were incarcerated and tortured in this building during the occupation. They also had a third wing at the Regina Coeli, Rome's most famous prison, and that was used by the Gestapo. Anybody sentenced to death here was taken to a fort to the west of Rome called Fort Bervetta and executed. There is a memorial to all the partisans who were shot here. If anybody's seen the film Roma Città Aperta, Rome Open City, the executions by firing squad, this is where they take place. The Germans move into one of the best hotel areas in the city. To the north of it, you've got the Borghese Gardens. You see the wall of Rome going around, and this is Via Vittoria Veneto with a lot of the best hotels in town. Not all, there's some very, very good ones outside. Hotel Flora becomes the Gestapo hotel. Hotel Excelsior becomes the main general's senior officers hotel. The U.S. Embassy is closed at this point. This is the Palace of the Corporations, which I'd mentioned that Mussolini built to control industry, and Hotel Bernini Bristol, another very smart hotel. This is the most heavily defended part of Rome for obvious reasons. The Germans keep this under very tight control. Moving into the Excelsior with the Nazis is Mr. Buffarini Guidi, who's now the most senior fascist in Rome, and he lives in a suite at the hotel. Working for him are the police chief, Pietro Caruso, and Pietro Koch, who is a fascist gang dedicated to destroying the resistance in Rome. These two guys both get executed at Forte Bervetta after the liberation. This guy gets caught trying to escape into Switzerland with Mussolini and gets executed in Milan at the end of the war. But right now, they're in Rome and they're running torture chambers and prisons throughout the city and chasing down the resistance. Who are the resistance? Well, we have the monarchists. This is Colonel Giuseppe Cordero Lanzi di Montezemolo, and he's head of the clandestine military front. So it's the monarchist army, and he's organizing that resistance in Rome and communicating with the king and Badoglio in the south. He's focused on intelligence gathering inside Rome and partisan actions outside. People in Rome don't want to see fighting in the city. The Pope definitely does not want to see fighting in the city. The Germans want to avoid fighting in the city. They've got enough to handle with the Allies heading up the peninsula. He is captured in January 1994, and he is personally welcomed to Via Tasso by Colonel Kappler himself. Another group is the resistance of the Committee of National Liberation. These are actually the resistance. They are Ivan Bonomo, who was the prime minister before Mussolini, Alcide de Gasperi, who after the war becomes prime minister, Ivan Bonomo also after the war becomes prime minister, Sandro Bertini becomes president. Off to one side is the Communist Party, who are communicating, but they're not really part of this group. They have their own thing. These guys had come into Rome to negotiate with Badoglio the return of democracy to Italy. And as they were negotiating, they didn't know anything about the armistice negotiations happening, and they certainly didn't know the king was going to run away in the middle of the night. They're now in Rome with the Germans moving in from every side. Where do they go? This is St. John Lateran. Founded in 324 AD, it is the oldest basilica in the Western world, and it is the seat of the Bishop of Rome, who's the Pope. In the seminary of St. John Lateran, because it's on Vatican territory, there were 800 people being hidden there. Those 800 were pretty much VIPs. Throughout Rome, people were getting into Vatican properties for safety. This is almost the VIP edition because, as I mentioned, future political establishment of Italy, including two presidents and two future prime ministers, are hiding in the cemetery here. There are also a lot of noble families, young men from noble families like the Colonna, the Feltrinelli, etc., are hiding here to avoid the draft into the army. These people are literally 5 minutes walk from the Gestapo torture chambers at Via Tasso. The only reason why they're not arrested by the Gestapo is that they are on Vatican territory, and the Nazis are trying to respect Vatican territory to not have any problem with the Pope. The fascists, on the other hand, are quite happy to go into Vatican territory because the Pope refuses to recognize Mussolini's government. But anyway, the Germans respect the fact that they were not going to go into this land, even though the actual leadership of the resistance is in there. The Germans have got machine guns posted outside the Holy Steps here. This is Villa Volkomsky, which is the German ambassador's residence, which is why Via Tasso was an annex of the ambassador's residence. That is now the British ambassador's residence because it was taken over at the end of the war. Here are the Roman walls going through, and there's St. John's Gate through the wall. Amongst the people hiding in the seminary are 48 Jewish citizens, mainly industrialists. The Jewish community of Rome, on the news of the fall of fascism, celebrated. As people did throughout Rome, you see many images of the Roman citizens smashing fascist symbols, and that was the day of the fall of Mussolini announced. And they were celebrated in the Jewish ghetto because they'd had lords against them since 1938. In the background, though, you see the portico of Ottavia. Nowadays, this area here is called 16th of October, 1943 Square. Colonel Kaplan organized the raid on the Jewish ghetto in Rome. At 5:30 in the morning on the 16th of October, the SS surrounded the Rome ghetto and over 1,000 people, mainly women and children, were rounded up. There's a Shoah museum inside the ghetto and also memorial plaques in the ghetto, but I just want to concentrate on another plaque, which is the Tiburtina railway station, which is the second largest railway station in Rome. On platform 1, there is the memorial. Meditate that this happened by Primo Levi. Primo Levi is probably the most famous Holocaust survivor, Italian Holocaust survivor. He wrote the book, Is This a Man? Sequestro un Uomo, and the truth about being in Auschwitz, and he survived, and he wrote this. And the description below says, on October 16th, 1943, more than 1,000 Roman Jews, entire families, men, women, and children were torn from their homes, guilty only of existing. On October the 18th, enclosed in steel wagons, they were deported by the Nazis from the station to the extermination camps. 16 men and only 1 woman returned. Their memory and that of all the Roman deportees, Jewish political military workers shall be a perennial warning so that similar tragedies must not be experienced. And this is my pew, which means never again. The Rome City Council and the Jewish community of Rome. Next to it is a tribute to the railway workers, 6 railway workers. The plaque says they wanted to oppose the Nazi invader in any way. They opened the wagons to let the deportees escape, saving them from extermination camps. They sabotaged vehicles and installations, and they joined the partisans and died on the 25th of March, 1944 at the Argentine Caves for having fought against fascism in the name of a free, democratic, and united Italy. This is from the railway workers' Rome. Throughout Rome, there are the little brass plaques in the doorways to give individual names and stories to the victims of the Nazis. And on the little plaques are scribbled the names of the people who inhabit. There are thousands of these throughout Rome. There are thousands of these throughout Europe. It was a project started, I believe, in Austria to put the names to the victims of the Holocaust. And you'll find these throughout Rome. After the big roundup of the ghetto, the fascist gangs were given the tasks of capturing Jewish citizens, and they were paid by the Gestapo for every Jewish citizen they handed. In the end, about 2,091 Jewish citizens ended up deported to extermination camps. Most of the Jews of Rome survived. Many were hidden by Catholic networks. At Castel Gandolfo, there were 3,000, and there were 1,500 hidden in monasteries, convents, and colleges. Another 3,700 were hidden in private homes. If you look around Rome, you'll see on certain buildings, this is the Catholic University of America. Certain buildings have got this little sign on them. And if I show you what the sign is, it's from the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation, recognizing houses of life, the buildings that were sheltered innocent people who were persecuted by the Nazis. The International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation is proud to declare this site as a house of life in tribute to the rescuers who upheld the values of solidarity and civic courage in accordance with the legacy of Raoul Wallenberg. There's signs throughout Rome. Now, one organization which is amongst those hiding Jewish citizens was the Rome Escape Network. I mentioned Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, who was played by Gregory Peck. This organization was originally set up to help the escaped prisoners of war. At the time of the armistice, 80,000 prisoners of war were held in Italy. When the armistice, over half of them just escaped from the prisons, and 18,000 were not recaptured. Many of them were not recaptured because the assistance given to them by Italian civilians and by networks such as Hugh O'Flaherty. Their network managed to hide 6,000 people throughout Rome. Colonel Kapler was trying to get O'Flaherty, but again, they respected the Vatican City property. Around St. Peter's Square, a white line was painted around the square, and snipers were placed in the buildings on the Italian side, and if O'Flaherty stepped over the line, the snipers were to shoot him. Okay? Another group that was being hunted by Kapler was the American Spy Network. With the Allies reaching the Gustav Line, the Gustav Line's a formidable fortification centered on Cassino. The Allies were planning to land in Anzio behind the defensive line and head for Rome. To assist in that, there was a young man sent into Rome. He was dropped up in a boat north of Rome and headed into the city. It's a young man called Peter Tompkins. Peter Tompkins was from Georgia, USA, and he had grown up in Rome and spoke perfect Italian. He was trained with the OSS down in Caserta and headed back into Rome where he'd grown up. He links up with Maurizio Giglio. He's a young Italian who's fought at St. Paul's Gate against the German invasion of the city. He's then gone down to the Americans. He's been trained as a radio operator, and he heads back into the city to help Peter Tompkins communicate with the Allies. Baron Francesco Malfatti, or Franco, has got a Socialist Party network of spies throughout the city, street cleaners, railway workers, tram drivers, and they are watching every German movement going through the city. All that information passed back through those workers throughout the city is collated and translated by Tompkins and passed on and radioed down to the Allies via Maurizio Giglio. Tompkins had thought he wouldn't be in Rome too long because he knew the Anzio landings were coming up. But as we know, the Anzio landings didn't get the breakthrough. They didn't get out of Rome fast enough, and they ended up being surrounded by the Germans and bottled into Anzio for months. The Germans attacked Anzio. Many Roman streets were just cordoned off, and anybody who could work was just, every Italian civilian in Rome was just said, go down to Anzio and dig ditches and fortifications. The Germans attacked Anzio, but the information that Tompkins and the network had collected about German troop movements was enough to save the beachhead. The information gathering is improving. The coordination with the partisans outside the city is getting better and better. Tompkins is organizing airdrops of food and ammunition to the partisans outside the city. Once again, inside Rome, just information gathering. Outside Rome, the partisans are like blocking the German convoys so the Allied Air Force could hit them. Tompkins is doing the communication, but then disaster strikes. Maurizio Giglio goes to pick up a radio, and he's caught by a fascist gang. He ends up in a fascist torture chamber near Termini Station. Tompkins and Franco try to escape across the lines back to the Americans because they have no radio anymore. They can't communicate back, but they can't get across the lines, so they end up hiding out in Rome for the next 4 months. As I said, everybody was trying to avoid fighting in Rome. The Pope, the Germans, the Allies, but there was one group who was quite happy to attack the Germans in Rome, and that was the group of Patriotic Action, which is the communist partisans, and they attacked the Germans throughout the city. They attacked the Gestapo at the Hotel Flora. They attacked the German Officers Club at Termini Station, but their most famous attack is at Via Rasella. At Via Rasella, a German column of troops is attacked. The day is March the 23rd, 1944. That is the 25th anniversary of the foundation of the Fascist Party. Every year the fascists had celebrated. They want to celebrate this year because it's the 25th anniversary. The Germans refuse. They don't want trouble in the city. So the fascists are allowed to have their party, but only at the palace of the corporations inside the heavily defended German zone. That means that the communist partisans could no longer attack the fascists, and they attack a German column that every day marches up the Via Rasella. They place a cleaning cart with a bomb in it in the street, and as the German troops go past, they blow it up and they machine gun the column. Via Rasella today has still got the marks on the wall from the explosion and from the machine guns. Via Rasella is in an interesting place. At the top of the road is the Palazzo Barini, but it is right by Via Vittoria Veneto. In that palace of the corporations, the fascists and their Nazi guests are having their party celebrating 25 years of fascism. They hear the noise. They go out to Via Rasella. A lot of them are quite drunk, and they see the dead and dying Germans in the street, and they just go crazy. Everybody is rounded up who's in the area. They think they're going to blow up the whole street. And what happens is the message gets back to Hitler of what's happened. Hitler demands that 10 Italians are shot for every German who dies. Colonel Kappler and Captain Prieb could set about drawing up a list of people to shoot. They take everybody who's at Via Tasso torture chambers. They take everybody they have at Via at the Regina Coeli prison. They haven't got enough to make 330, so they start calling around the fascists, and the fascists hand over Maurizio Giglio for the list of people to be shot. They still don't have enough, so they then take any Jewish citizen they can get hold of. They have their 330. They head out to the south of Rome near the Catacombs of Domitian, where there are the Ardeatine Caves. At the Ardeatine Caves, Colonel Kappler has worked out that to meet Hitler's deadline of 24 hours, 10 Italians for every German within 24 hours, they're going to have to shoot them 4 at a time, no less rites, no less prayers, next 4. 4 at a time, 330, that's still 82, 83 people times of shooting somebody in the back of the head. Kappler sends down brandy to help his troops get through this. By the end of the shooting, they are so drunk they're taking 3 or 4 shots to kill people. They finally shoot the last 5 people. They took 5 extra people by accident. They shoot those. They blow up the entrance to the cave. And this is the Ardeatine Caves Memorial today. After the liberation, an Italian doctor took all the remains and separated all the skeletons so they could all be buried separately. And this is the Ardeatine Caves Memorial to the day. There is the tomb of Colonel Montezemolo. There is the tomb of Maurizio Giglio, who was both murdered. On the side of the Great Synagogue in Rome is the list of all the Jewish citizens who were murdered at the Ardeatine Caves. At the top of Via Rasella is the memory of the 10 Italian citizens who were rounded up in the picture we saw, who just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time ended up being murdered at the Ardeatine Caves. After this, the resistance is struggling. Kappler is cracking down. Hunger is in the city. People are being rounded up for forced labor in Germany all the time. There's desperation in the city, and Anzio is being bombed to hell. But spring is in the air, and finally, the things start to move down on the Gustav line. On the Gustav line, the 4th Battle of Cassino is about to start. The British have moved divisions silently over from the East Coast. They now line up with the Americans to take the sea route. The French expedition called to climb the Aranci Mountains, the British to take the Liri Valley, and the Poles to take the Abbey of Monte Cassino. They bomb Kesselring's headquarters at Monte Serrati as the opening start of the battle, but they break through the Gustav line, they break through the Senga line. At this point, breaking out of the Anzio beachhead are the Americans there. They're heading towards Valmontone to cut off the retreat of the Germans coming up from the Gustav line. General Mark Clark changes the route of attack and sends them to Rome. They don't close the Valmonte gap, they head into Rome. There is one German defensive line left. That is the Caesar Sea line here. To get through it, the American 36th Infantry, the Texans, together with Italian partisans, climb Monte Artemisia and come down behind the German lines. At this point, Kesselring realized that he has to abandon Rome and withdraw to the north. They're going to abandon Rome because it has no strategic value. They're far better off getting back to good prepared defensive positions. And also Hitler says, don't fight in Rome. It's too precious a city. For Kesselring to get his men out of Rome, he needs to keep the road open here. And so there is a rear guard here. So his troops going from Anzio can get out. In the meantime, everybody's moving towards Rome. General Mark Clark wants Rome to be an American-only prize, so the British army, the British troops that fought at Anzio are sent out towards Fiumicino, where the airport is nowadays. Everybody else is heading into Rome. Spearheading the attack is the 1st Special Service Force, and they are fighting the Germans' rear guard at Centocelli, which is now, it's kind of in the suburbs. It's got a railway station there now. As they're fighting, General Mark Clark turns up because he wants a picture for the newspapers of him being in Rome. And he says to Brigadier General Frederick of the 1st Special Service Force, you know, what's holding things up? We've got 4 hours to meet the press deadline. Frederick says, well, we're in the middle of a battle, sir. Okay, but when there's a lull in the fighting, General Mark Clark goes and gets this picture for the press of him with the Roma sign to say we're in Rome. As he's standing there, the Germans open fire again, and he has to run back across the road to safety. That Roma sign was taken as a souvenir by Mark Clark and is now in Charleston, South Carolina. The Americans break through. They head into the city. The Germans are abandoning equipment and disappearing. The Italians are celebrating. There's an American troop on the side. The Italians are celebrating. As they head through the suburbs of Rome, the locals lead the Americans past the booby traps and any other obstacles the Germans have left. And in the city, Peter Tompkins goes to his documents and takes out the official OSS note paper. He takes off the official OSS stamp and he writes orders to the police of Rome to defend the bridges and the public buildings and the government buildings. Peter Tompkins has been hunted by the Gestapo for 5 months. He's seen many of his collaborators murdered or at the Argentine caves or tortured at the Gestapo headquarters. And he suddenly begins to think that he might actually survive the war. And he's walking in Piazza Venezia, the center of Rome, at a day when the Americans are getting closer and closer. And then there's suddenly a big fuss in the square, and there's a young girl running up, and she's shouting, the Americans are at St. Paul's. The Americans are at St. Paul's. And Peter Tompkins is a bit nervous because he's so close to being freed. And he says to the little girl, how do you know that they're Americans? Because he thinks it could be a trick to get the partisans to show themselves. And the girl says, they handed a man a tin of meat and beans. And then Peter Tompkins said, only the Americans hand out rations. That day, the Americans were at the Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls and heading into the walls, through the walls of Rome itself. This is Porta Maggiore, the Great Gate. This is St. John's Gate. And through that gate is St. John Lateran. And in that building, all those politicians who'd been hiding for 9 months can come out and take over the governance of Italy. And on that day, the 4th of June, General Frederick, commander of the 1st Special Service Corps, establishes his headquarters in the American Embassy in Rome. And this is the plaque on the side of the American Embassy or consulate in Rome. That same day, the 4th of June, at the Great Synagogue, in memory of Charles Aaron Golub, the first American Jewish soldier who entered the synagogue and prayed to celebrate the liberation of Rome on June the 4th, 1944. The same day, Peter Tompkins, who spent 5 months hiding out in Rome all over the city, can finally leave his hideouts and move into a suite at the Excelsior Hotel that the German generals have left that morning. Peter Tompkins is remembered in Rome at the American University of Rome. There's a little memorial there, and this is the memorial, and it simply reads, Free Rome salutes an American hero, Peter Tompkins, 1919 to 2007. On the 5th of June, the next morning, the American army are marching into the city of Rome. There they are by the Vittoriano monument. The Italian locals are celebrating the liberation of the city. General Mark Clark arrives, and he wants to have a meeting at City Hall with the press. And he ends up at St. Peter's Square because they don't know the way. And Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty goes over to General Clark and asks him if he can help him. And when he finds out that Clark is trying to get to City Hall, Hugh O'Flaherty finds a young boy on a bicycle and gives a bit of money and says, follow the boy on the bicycle, he's going to take you to City Hall. Inside the Vatican is the memorial to Monsignor O'Flaherty, born in Ireland, 1898, founder of the Rome Escape Line, tireless defender of the weak and oppressed. Resided in this college 1938 to 1960, where he saved over 6,000 lives from the National Socialists. Buried in Caerphilly, County Kerry, Ireland. This sign is in German and English because O'Flaherty lived in the Teutonic College inside the Vatican. He lived with the German priests. Mark Clark gets to City Hall. This is the Capitoline Museums. They're at the top of the steps of City Hall. Nobody has the key to get into City Hall, so they have their press meeting at the top of the steps. The news goes around the world that Rome has been liberated. That afternoon at 6 p.m., the Pope Pius comes out on the balcony to address the crowd of people in St. Peter's Square. The American forces are there. Thousands of escaped prisoners of war are there because they could finally come out of hiding. There are Jews who could finally come out of hiding in the square. There are thousands of refugees from the fighting at Cassino who know they can finally go home. It's a great celebration, and the news goes around the world that Rome has been liberated. The next morning, the Allies land in Normandy. The liberation of Europe has begun, and Rome and the Italian campaign are forgotten, are off the front page of the newspapers and forgotten by many. Mark Clark complains that he only had the front page for a day. The fighting in Italy continues with many brave soldiers and heroic actions, and Rome just becomes a quiet spot where an army of the United Nations can relax and enjoy the sights of Rome. Anybody going for rest and recreation in Rome knows they're not going to get bombed. Instead, they can get a donut by the Colosseum, enjoy the sights around the Roman Forum, or just relax in the sunshine. And it's not just the Americans, but it's the Polish troops, the Indian troops, the Australian troops. On the left-hand side of this monument here is a small memorial placed here in the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Rome to the troops who liberated 50 years after the liberation of Rome in memory of all the fallen of the Italian campaign, 4th of June 1944, 4th of June 1994, the veterans of the Italian campaign. This small monument is quite a humble tribute to what was a momentous achievement and momentous moment when the Eternal City was liberated. This is the monument that remembers the time that an army of United Nations fighting at Cassino, Anzio, and throughout the whole of the Italian peninsula liberated the Eternal City of Rome.